which is a presentation and discussion of preparations for the 2021 legislative session, and that it will be presented by Mita Draziloff and David Hoffman and Heidi Berry of GRS. If you all will join us, we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm going to try and share my screen at this point. Hopefully you can see our presentation on the screen. Is that correct?
Yes.
Super. Okay. Well, this is the agenda for this morning. We're going to just go over a very brief recap of our February and April meetings, a very brief recap there. Talk about some considerations and possible timelines for the legislative changes that we'll be talking about today, and that the board asked us to look at. The third bullet there, we have a section. Remember at the April 2020 board meeting, there were various supplemental evaluations that various board members asked us to evaluate, and we're very hopeful that they could see all the results as of this meeting. We worked really hard to do that for the board, not just the supplemental results, but the projections that you see in the final bullet. I will, just given what we heard in the minutes with Mr. Duthit, you'll see a 5-year FAC period, not a 6-year FAC period, only because that's what we saw in the minutes. So we based our supplemental valuations based upon what we saw in the actual minutes. And our apologies, there's Mr. Duthit, but we can do that at a future date if necessary.
No problem. Thank you.
So very brief recap. At the February board meeting, we talked about the evolution of the unfunded accrued liability, roughly about $2.4 billion as of June 30th, 2019. At the April board meeting, context was provided regarding any of the proposed changes that the board may want to pursue. And the board was presented with a preview of what the June 2020 actuarial valuation results may show, depending upon various market rates of return for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2020. So as a result of those discussions, we're presenting the results of the supplemental valuations in this presentation, both what I'll call on a static basis, and I'll explain that a little bit later on in the slides, as well as a projection similar to what we showed back in April over the next 15 years of what the expectations would be if the various proposed benefit changes were in place, and to also establish next steps. The board has seen this in the last couple of slides, so I'm not going to really harp on that one too much. Just a very brief mention here that the board has seen this slide as well. The things that we're focusing on the supplemental valuations today are pretty much the bottom left-hand blue portion, the employee contributions. There was talk about increasing the employee contribution rate, and obviously the bottom right red one, the other benefit provisions of the system. Back in April, we did the market return for fiscal year 2020 scenarios. We did one on 5, 0, -5, -10, -15. This slide here shows a result of the summary results of those presentations. We thought this was helpful for the board, just so that they could remember what they had seen before. The reason the -5% return is highlighted is, at least when we were doing the projections, that was the most reasonable estimate of what we thought the market value return was going to be for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2020. And you'll see on our projections later on that becomes sort of the base scenario. If the benefit provisions aren't changed, we're basing all of the results of our projections assuming a -5% market value return for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2020. This slide here, remember, is basically the amortization period that would be necessary to maintain a 15.32% employer contribution rate, which sometimes is spoken to quite a bit. And the reason that the results for the June 30th, 2023 evaluation, which is the fourth row down, which would establish the employer contribution rate for the period beginning July 1st, 2025 is shown, is that if we maintained a 30-year amortization period, that would be the highest employer contribution rate of 16.27% of payroll. So that's one of the reasons we're sort of highlighting that row in some of the schedules you'll see going forward. By all means, please stop me if you have any questions. A lot of it we've seen before, but by all means, if you have any questions, please stop me. So let's talk about considerations and possible timeline. Okay, so after discussions today, the board may wish to see some alternate supplemental valuations based upon some of the benefit provisions already identified. In addition, the board may wish to see some supplemental valuations based upon benefit provisions that didn't even come up last April. So, for example, the early retirement reduction factors. Possible timeline, it could be that once the board sees the results of the legislative packages that we've evaluated so far, that a decision is made today. Possibly another interim meeting if the board can't come to a decision today between now and August. I think the thought is probably making a decision in August might be too late. So if the board doesn't make a decision today, that there might be a potential interim meeting in the next month or two to reach a final decision. We're not pressuring the board to make a decision today. This is a very important decision that the board has to make. But if the board wishes to make that decision today, we think that's fine. But if they don't, we think probably another interim meeting might be necessary. So let's go back to the April 20th meeting. The board requested supplemental evaluations at the interim meeting in April, generally fell into the following categories. The first one were member contribution rate changes for contributory members. Remember that our participants that participate in the contributory plan contribute 5% of payroll currently. Now, one thing to note there is that there weren't any what I'll call equivalent changes considered for non-contributory members. We have roughly about 9,000 individuals who are still active that participate in the non-contributory plan. We didn't make any benefit changes to them. The board didn't ask for that. So any changes that were made in the member contribution rate for contributory members, a quote unquote equivalent change for non-contributory members wasn't considered. Obviously, the cost of living allowance came up, so we've done some proposals there. Proposals with respect to the final average compensation period, or what we call FAC, and a couple of different changes with respect to vesting. One, either changing the current 5-year vesting period to 10 years, or something we call 10-year quasi vesting, meaning that a member would receive a lower benefit multiplier if they terminated employment within the first 10 years of service. Now, the board also had some discussions as to which groups may or may not be affected by the legislative changes. There was really no decisions made at the time, but there was some discussions there. I think Mr. Brady brought up sort of these categories in thinking about which members should or should not be affected by a benefit change. Current retirees, including drop members, and I am going to make a clarification when we talk about that breakdown a little bit later on. Drop members can be thought of as current retirees, or they could be thought of as current active members. One of the reasons being is they're actually performing active service. They actually haven't retired yet. Their retirement benefit has somewhat been calculated. It actually goes into what we call a drop account, but they're still providing active service to their employers. So once you see the results later on, we'll clarify what we mean by which group we're covering. We talked about vested active members, i.e. those individuals basically that have 5 or more years of service, non-vested, those that have less than 5 years of service, and individuals that aren't even in the plan yet, new hires. The next 3 slides that you're going to see are the supplemental valuation results as of June 30th, 2019. And what that means is it's assumed that the benefit change would have been in effect as of that valuation date. That's what the results in the next few slides are going to mean. Obviously, that's not going to happen. The legislative session happens in 2021, and you're going to see later on where we actually have an implementation date of July 1st, 2022. But one of the reasons we show results in this fashion is it gives the boards somewhat of a sense of what the 2022 valuation would sort of show once it becomes effective immediately, so that you're not being sort of misled on what the reduction in the unfunded accrued liability would be once the benefits actually were effective. So that's one of the reasons we do this. One of the other reasons we do this is it's quite challenging to say what the difference in the 2021 or 2022 valuation results might be, given the fact that these changes could affect members that aren't even in the system yet. So our best information to date are those individuals that are participants as of June 30th, 2019. So that's what these slides mean. Just a little bit of an explainer on what some of these tables here mean. So column A on the following slides is the decrease in the June 30th, 2019 amortization period to maintain an employer contribution rate of 15.32%. We've heard, at least from various board members, that that's a pretty important thing. So for example, if proposal 1 here had been in effect as of the valuation date, that would mean that the amortization period to maintain the 15.32% employer contribution rate would have been 21.2 years and not the 24 years that was actually the June 30th, 2019 amortization period. Alternatively, column B says, okay, if we would have allowed the employer contribution rate to go down, i.e. keep the 24-year amortization period on the existing unfunded accrued liability and amortize the other reduction in the unfunded accrued liability due to the benefit change over a 20-year period, then we could have actually reduced the employer contribution rate from 15.32% to 14.74%. The difference being that column B on proposal 1, that's 0.58%. What the board needs to understand is either column A could have happened or column B could have happened, but not both. So that's a very important consideration there. Column C would have been the reduction in the unfunded accrued liability as of June 30th, 2019 due to the benefit change. And sometimes there's considerations of only affecting new hires, and that's what you're going to see in column D. So basically, column D is trying to illustrate if this change really were to only affect new hires, then what would be the reduction in the employer normal cost over the next 5 years, 10 years, and then ultimately. The other way of thinking about that is, if you didn't want to reduce the employer normal cost, you would actually have that contribution in addition to help finance the unfunded accrued liability. So you could think about that in sort of 2 different ways. So this here shows the member contribution rates that we were asked to evaluate. So we were asked to evaluate a 6%, a 6.5%, and then a 7% member contribution rate. So if, as of June 30th, 2019, for example, and let's go to the 7% member contribution rate, that were in effect as of that time, we could have had a 19-year amortization period, which is the 24 minus the 5, and still had the 15.32% employer contribution rate. Alternatively, we could have reduced the employer contribution rate from 15.32%. We could have reduced that by 1.16%. Now, if obviously the unfunded accrued liability doesn't change one iota when the member contribution rate just changes as of that date. So there's no decrease in the unfunded accrued liability. Basically, it's extra revenue that we're expecting to come into the system over time. And then if we go to the right-hand column on column D and doing the 7% scenario, 5 years out, we would be getting an extra, basically 0.55% in contributions as a percentage of payroll, 0.88, and then ultimately, once all the members are contributory, 1.6%. So that's what those columns mean. This here shows the cost of living allowance changes. And one thing I would also mention, we are just showing.
Madam Chair, are we waiting till the end to ask questions, I assume?
No, I would go ahead. I think you could ask questions anytime. Please.
Yeah, I'm comfortable answering questions right now. If that's
so would you do me a favor and give me a real number there? When you're saying, what the current payroll is, I assume you do. Can you give me a real number for column D, 6.5? 6.5 at 0.87%. What's that real number?
0.88%. The 10 years.
I'm sorry, column B under number 2. Like just give me what 0.87% of payroll is.
Oh, I understand the question. Our total payroll is on the order of about 1.9 billion. Our total contribution payroll. And David and Heidi, I think, are listening, so correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that would be about on the order of about $16 million on the order.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Yes, thank you.
And you'll see some, Ms. Lee, you'll see some projections going forward where we show, because it's sort of difficult to see that in a 1 year. What we're going to show is a 15-year projection of all of these scenarios, including the phase-in periods that the board asked for. And you're going to see sort of the evolution of how the unfunded accrued liability changes over time because of it.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman, may I ask a question, please?
Yes, please. Go ahead, Judge.
And this would be to the board. It was my understanding from the board that we were thinking that we were not going to change the employer contribution rate from 15.32 going forward. We're going to keep that steady, understanding where we are, and we were looking at that continued source of income along with adjusting employee contributions. So whenever we see these assumptions about reducing that, is that a policy that we need to clarify that the board wants to maintain the 15.32 going forward, and also that we want to get the amortization period to the number of years where the unfunded actuarial liability does not go up anymore, and that was another goal. So I'm just trying to understand, is that as far as goals, goals of the board, do we need to clarify those and then use those goals to try to help prioritize where we're going with the proposed changes?
Madam Chairman,
Yes, go ahead.
Madam Chairman, this is Daryl Bassett. I'm with the judge on this, Judge Hudson, and also I need to just kind of get a clarification. Are these numbers, as we're talking about, as I think Mr. Brady had suggested, are these numbers including current retirees? Are these including drop members as well?
These are including, and what we'll talk about a little bit later in the projections as well. These are including retirees. The answer is no, because once you're retired, you're not making member contributions anymore. So not on this line.
So drop members are not included in these numbers?
Drop members would be included in these numbers. We consider drop members
would be included in these numbers.
Yes.
Okay.
Because we consider an individual participating in the drop plan still an active member. So if they're required, and off the top of my head, I can't remember if they're still required to make member contributions during the drop period. But if they are, then they would be covered under this provision. Yes.
Okay. Very, very good. Thank you.
And I do remember Mr. Brady bringing up those 4 categories in the April meeting. What I don't recall is any particular proposal where it was said that only this benefit change would affect only certain categories. And what we didn't want to do, if we were to do all of the benefit changes affecting all of the permutations of members that could or could not be affected, this presentation, instead of 30 slides, would be about 120 slides. And that's one of the reasons we didn't do that. What we're going to see going forward in the projections is all members are affected. Now, the one where it's a little bit different is this slide here. We did break it a little bit because the COLA by far is the most challenging benefit provision to decide who is and who is not going to be affected by the benefit change. So for the COLA changes, and to decide who is and who is not going to be affected by the benefit change. So for the COLA changes, 2 different types of COLA changes were articulated at the last board meeting. One was a 3% simple COLA, and one was the continuation of the compound COLA, but at the lesser of 3% or whatever the increase in CPI is. So that's what this slide is presenting. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is, so let's first start with proposals 7 through 9. Our assumption that we used in that scenario was a 2.2% COLA, because you're not always going to get the 3. Our price inflation assumption that we use for valuation purposes 2.5, but we do a real random model. We do like multiple thousand scenarios of what CPI could be, and say, okay, it's either, if it's less than 3%, that's what the COLA assumption is. If it's 3% or more, it's 3%. And then we average all those out, and 2.2 percent became the COLA assumption. The drop participants, once they enter the drop, do not make contributions. So in the previous slide, this would not affect drop participants since they're not making the member contributions already. In this scenario here, so for example, the 3% simple COLA, I think one of the thought process was maybe 3% simple COLA for a portion in the membership and then a version of a compound COLA for another portion of the membership. At least for here, we're just saying everybody is affected. Administratively, if you actually had a simple COLA for part of your population and a compound COLA for the other part of your population, that would be a pretty challenging thing, I think, administratively for the system to handle. Not saying it's impossible, but I do think that's a pretty challenging thing for the system to handle. In Proposal 4, where the 3% simple COLA affects all members, if you're a retiree, your simple COLA would be based upon the way we valued it, your benefit that's in effect when the simple COLA became effective. So for example, if I retired 20 years ago, I've already received 3% compound COLA for a 20-year period. We would say whatever your benefit is as of June 30th, 2019, at least on this slide, that becomes the benefit upon which your 3% simple COLA is based, not your benefit 20 years ago. So just to be clear on that point. And as you can see here, and we also showed new hires only, because there has been consideration of making the COLA change just for new hires. So we've showed that. So all members means basically everybody is affected. All non-retired members in that instance means that only retirees are not affected. Drop members, active members, new hires are affected. So that's what this slide here means. This here is
fair enough. That's a good explanation. That's a good explanation, and that's an explanation that we can take to the public, and that I think people can at least understand. I appreciate that.
And I think they can understand it. That's not saying we're endorsing that. We're just wanting to explain to the board what we did do. It might be that the board comes back and says, yeah, we really shouldn't think that drop members should be affected. And then we would have to come up with some numbers to reflect that. We just want the board to know exactly what it is we did do here.
No, I understand it's explainable. I do understand that there's going to be considerable concern about drop members being affected, but I do understand that is a very good explanation of what we're trying to do.
Thank you. This here, so in this instance here, we measured the 5-year FAC period, but that's a little bit tricky, because what we did here is we said, okay, the 3-year FAC period is already in place. So we're going to compute your 3-year FAC period as of the benefit change date. Going forward, we're going to determine a new FAC based upon a 5-year FAC period. Basically, you get the greater, your benefit is frozen on the 3-year FAC, and then the ultimate 5-year FAC is ultimately what gets you. So somebody who's really young is going to be mostly covered under a 5-year FAC period. But for those that are older, they still have a 3-year FAC period covering part of that provision. And the 10-year vesting is very easy to understand. Basically, 5 years is going to go up to 10 years. Obviously, if you already are vested between 5 and 10 years of service, we wouldn't say you were unvested then. So that's not part of this. And the 10-year quasi vesting, what we mean by that is, instead of the benefit multiplier that's currently in place for everybody, if you terminate service with less than 10 years of service, you get a 1.6% benefit multiplier instead of whatever benefit multiplier would be in place, i.e. the roughly about 2% benefit multiplier. Okay, so the following slides are very similar to what the board saw in April. We tried to do projections of the requested scenarios. They're not meant to comment on what we actually think the future valuation results are going to be. But for example, on the member contribution rate ones, it's very difficult to show how it evolves over time, especially when you're trying to phase in the member contribution rates. As I mentioned before, the scenarios are based upon the -5% market value return scenario for fiscal year 2020. And obviously the projection results are going to be highly dependent upon whatever market value rate of return scenario chosen. Well, in addition, for projection purposes, it's assumed that the proposed benefit change would have been effective as of June 30th, 2022. So that's what the projections are based upon. So for member contribution rate changes, fiscal year 2023 is the first assumed affected fiscal year for the increase in the member contributions. For the COLA changes, the July 1st, 2022 COLA is the first COLA assumed to be affected. So for example, the one where we did the lesser of CPI or 3%, the one based upon our 2.2% assumption. The assumption would be that you get the 3% COLA as of July 1st, 2020. You get the 3% COLA as of July 1st, 2021. But then come July 1st, 2022, then you would get the lesser of CPI or 3%. If it was CPI increased by 2.2%, that's what it would be. In the simple example, basically you get a 3% simple COLA based upon your 2021 benefit. So that's really no different than the 3% compound COLA in the first year, because you're getting 3% on 2021. That's no different than the compound COLA. But going forward from there, for example, the June 30th, 2023 COLA, you would get 3% of your 2021 benefit. That's your COLA increase, and that's how the simple COLA would work. And that would be, in addition, very hard to explain to the membership, especially if the type of COLA was bifurcated. When one group thinks they're getting 3%, they both think they're getting 3%, but they're getting 3% on different amounts. And that's where the simple and the compound COLA is a little bit tough to articulate if it gets bifurcated in that fashion.
So, Mita, this is Duncan. So once again, you're not proposing specific dates. You're really just explaining how you ran the numbers, right? The framework under which these assumptions were made is my understanding.
And thank you for chiming in there, Duncan. We had to make some assumptions, and we worked with staff on just what a particular time frame could be. This isn't suggesting that the board should choose these dates for effective dates. They're just what the projections are based upon. We had to choose a date. And so this is what was chosen after discussions with staff. The last sub-bullet, all members are assumed to be affected by the proposed benefit changes. Retirees, drop members, active members, new hires, everybody is assumed to be affected. If the board wishes us to only affect certain groups, we're more than happy to do so. But to try and do all of those combinations in this presentation would have just been overwhelming. You're going to see a lot of projection numbers already. We're more than happy to do it. But I think we have to narrow it down then. So when we look at the projections, remember that the June 30th, and maybe it's easier to show here, the June 30th, 2020 valuation is applied to the period beginning July 1st, 2022 for the employer contribution rate. So we would not reflect the new benefit, obviously, since the legislative session is going to be in 2021. We would not reflect any new benefit provisions as of June 30th, 2020. I mean, that's only a couple of months away. The very first valuation that we changed to reflect the new benefit provisions is the June 30th, 2021 valuation. Because we said, okay, we think we will know what the if, and only if, any legislative package actually gets changed, we should know by June 30th, 2021 what that is, and we can reflect it in that actuarial valuation, meaning that the first employer contribution rate that may be affected, if it's changed from 15.32%, would be for the period beginning July 1st, 2023. So just to make that clear. So the first few groups of slides are very similar. It's basically increasing the member contribution rate to either 6%, 6.5%, or 7%. The only difference is the phase-in period, whether it's phased in over 2 years, 4 years, or 8 years. Now, I don't think there was some talk about phasing some contribution rates over 2 years, some over 4 years, some over 8. I don't think it was all asked for, but we thought, well, let's do all of the phase-ins, all of the different member contribution rates that were asked for, to allow the board to see how that's all sort of works out. If you take a look, one of the things that's somewhat noticeable, one of the numbers that I'm going to focus on a little bit, is the phase-in period. So if you look at the far right, and one of the reasons, the projections sort of matter. If you look at the 7% over 2 years, the unfunded accrued liability, the expectation would be that it's $3.8 billion, which is the second column to the far right. That's if it's phased in over a 4-year period.
Which slide are you looking at?
I'm looking at, I think, Mr. Walther, I think that was you. It is slide 23, which is 62 in the board packet that I think we received.
Okay.
So if you look at the bottom right, if the 7% member contribution rate is phased in over a 2-year period, then our expected unfunded is about $3.8 billion. If it's over a 4-year period, $3.9 billion. Similarly, over an 8 period, $4.0 billion. So the phase-in period at the end of 15 years, at least on the 7% scenario, that's about $200 million difference. Alternatively, the 6% versus 7%. So I'm back on slide 23, 62 of the board packet. And let's just take a look at this one slide. The difference in increasing the member contribution rate to 6% over 2 years versus 7% over 2 years, that's about $400 million, the $4.2 billion at the end of the projection period versus the $3.8 billion. So you can see how, at least if you look at it just statically at time 0, nothing changes. But over a 15-year period, as you're getting more revenue into the system, that can have a pretty significant effect. And alternatively, if you look at it without doing anything, basically, if you go to the full extreme, 7% over 2 years, which again, we're not endorsing, but you can see the effect of it, you're expecting to reduce the unfunded accrued liability by almost $1 billion, from $4.7 billion under the base scenario, which is no benefit changes on the far left, to $3.8 billion. So just that one change, which is asking our members to contribute more, but that makes a substantial dent in the unfunded accrued liability 15 years out. Here's the projections on the COLA. These projections affect everybody. So you can sort of see it June 30th, 2021. You get a pretty significant reduction in the COLA. The more groups that we remove, you will get less of a reduction in the unfunded accrued liability. Having said that, we have our populations that they have less time to plan for it. There are older population retirees, on an income. So, that there's various considerations as to whether some groups should or should not be affected by the COLA change. I think we had some conversations. If I were designing a new plan, I think that compound COLA of the lesser of 3% or increase in CPI is a good benefit provision. So at least I think there should be some consideration to apply that to new hires. What portion of the current membership should or should not be affected by either of the two changes? That's a board decision at that point. There's not really actuarial in nature. There's various considerations there, and we're not endorsing any of the existing membership to or not to be covered by the COLA change. This here, but something as, I don't want to say minimal, because minimal is not the right term, but versus the COLA change, increasing from a 3-year to a 5-year FAC period. On average, that would change a person over their entire career, their benefit by about 4% at retirement. It's different per person, but on average, that's generally what it is. And you make a significant reduction in the unfunded accrued liability, even with that, what doesn't appear to be a really big change, but after a 15-year period, you're expecting to reduce the unfunded by about $500 million, which is making progress, which is a really good thing. We've said it before, and we'll say it again, and because I think it does need to be said, there is no right answer as to what the legislative changes should or should not be pursued, or which groups should or should not be covered by the changes. Hopefully we've provided enough material for the board to consider to either make a decision today, which might be challenging, or to ask us to make more refined, I'll call it more refined packages based on some of the things that the board has seen today. I know there's been, Mr. Hudson had brought up, goals of the board. That's probably a discussion that needs to happen, and also determining what refined packages may or may not want to be pursued. And with that, I'm more than happy to take any questions that any board members may have.
Madam Chairman?
Yes, go ahead, Jason.
Actually, not questions for him, but I would appreciate if I could ask Duncan a couple of questions, or maybe open it up for his comments. But with my question, Duncan, what I would love to hear in your overall reply to some of this is potentially your conversations with the chairs of the Joint Retirement Committee, as far as your understanding about what timelines we may or may not have. Also, as we look at some of these changes, again, to help us frame our thought process administratively, how would APERS do some of these things? And then, and I think of great importance to the board, I would really appreciate your thoughts about the Arkansas State Employees Association letter that came out on May 18th, and how this may or may not incorporate our thought process. So I'll stop with that and listen.
Yeah, absolutely. On the first question regarding the timing, we did have a Joint Retirement Committee meeting a couple of weeks ago. I visited with both chairs of the committee about the plans for the town halls later this year. They said they're looking at the August to September timeframe, which would be before the legislative budget hearings in October. We talked about how do we want to go about those, and the plan, as I understand it, it will probably be remote meetings of some kind, simply because we don't know what the circumstances will be like during that period of time, and but no matter what it's like, it will probably be unwise to get large groups of people together, certainly large groups of retirees together, just given the circumstances. So I think the time frame is August to September. I think if we do those remote, that will give us the possibility of meeting, and answering questions with, maybe even more members than we did previously. So, with that said, I think we've got plenty of time. I mean, I think we were on the right track as far as the discussions we've had and the time frame. If we wanted to come back and have a June meeting, and even if we needed to come back and have a later meeting, but certainly I think we have time to take any questions that we have today, or even if we wanted to put one or more things into a package and come back in June, I think we've got time for that. Your second question was on the implementation, I believe. We've looked internally, talked to Philip Norton, who is our Director of IT, talked to Allison Woods, who is our Director of Benefit Administration. They've worked with Vitech, who is our vendor for Compass, which is the pension administration system. We basically looked at each of these 4 proposals, the member contributions, final average compensation, vesting, and the COLA. We looked at those by, Mr. Brady, the various populations that you mentioned could be affected, because we wanted to be prepared for any scenario. We wanted to make sure it was possible to technically administer anything, and also kind of get an idea of, maybe what's more seamless, what's more difficult. And, the conclusion there was, there probably are best ways from a technical standpoint to implement things. Of course, we wouldn't want that to drive, completely drive a board decision as to what a benefit structure looks like. But, just to give you an idea for the member contributions, we do think the lowest complexity would be if a change in contributions was applied to all active members, which I think is in alignment with what had been discussed. On the final average compensation, once again, the lowest complexity would probably be to apply that to all members, which once again is kind of the direction we were going based on the conversations at the last meeting. From a vesting standpoint, there's probably going to be some complexity to that, simply because there's complexity around vesting just in general when you think about reciprocity and termination refunds and people coming back to work after a termination or switching employers. But it does look like, from a technical standpoint, if we applied that to new hires only, that would be illogical, and it could be complex to implement, but it might be easier to explain to members and employers, if we just had a date certain there. And then the COLA itself, because we do have a 3% fixed compound, whichever direction we go in, there's going to be probably a good bit of programming there. But once again, it's all manageable. But I do think we'd want to think, just from an implementation standpoint, I think our tech staff would definitely think about, what makes sense from that standpoint. So that's just kind of a quick overview based on the discussions we've had over the last few weeks, just trying to get ahead of the curve, so that if we had questions like this, we were prepared for that. But once again, I wouldn't suggest that any of that drive a decision, but certainly, when we think about, implementation dates and how we do something, if, it could be an important factor there. And then your third question was on, I believe it was on the ASEA letter. So, I think, as I mentioned at the last meeting, there were several clear themes when we went out and heard from the members at the town halls. On the discussion of a COLA change, we heard probably more than anything from retired members who said, we've already made a retirement decision. And, if you change the COLA, it's, we don't have an opportunity to adapt to that. We also heard that, members wanted the benefit, if there were changes, that if they could be, that those changes would reward long-time service, long-time members. We also heard that, members were willing to pay more, on the member contribution rate, and something unrelated to benefits is, members also suggested that maybe employers should pay more. But when you look at the ASC letter, just reading through that, and, I certainly don't want to speak for them. Y'all have the letter, but just, I guess the points that I kind of pulled out of it is, they did mention they had strong opposition to some of the legislation in 2019, but they recognize it's in the interest of the members that APERS remain strong. They said, and I'm kind of skipping around here, that, first consider the effect of any changes on retirees and employees who have already made life-altering decisions. And then at the end of the second paragraph, they said, we strongly oppose any changes to benefits or structures that state retirees currently receive or to the benefit formula that will be applicable to employees who are vested in their retirement benefits. So they do get pretty specific there. But then in the third paragraph, they go into specific proposals. And I'm just reading this, assuming that it's helpful. So if it's not helpful, let me know. But in the third paragraph, they say, if the trustees find that it is advisable to pursue legislative changes, we suggest that you consider the following options. 1, increase the contribution rate to 6% for new hires. I'll note that later in the paragraph, they say, if the trustees renew efforts to raise the contribution rate for existing employees from 5 to 6, we ask that you consider phasing it in over 4 years. And so, I think, the comment there, I think, aligns with what we heard at the town halls. I think it, probably to a great degree even aligns with the conversations we've had and at least, one or more of the scenarios that we've looked at. The bullet point number 2, they said increase the vesting period to 10 years for new hires, which I think also aligns with comments we heard at the town halls. Some of the, the proposals we're looking at already. Number 3, they said increase the final average salary formula calculation for everyone from 3 years to 5 years, which I think once again also aligns with, the sentiment that we heard at the town halls of rewarding long-term employment, or encouraging long-term employment, and it also aligns with, as I understand it, just reading these words with one of the proposals that we're looking at. So, so that's kind of, I guess, I'm just jumping around in their letter, but kind of the high points that I pulled from that without reading the whole letter to you. But I do think that, when you think about the feedback from the town halls, the proposals we're looking at, which were already based in part on that feedback, and then this additional feedback, very specific feedback from the State Employees Association, I think it gives us a lot to think about as we kind of, pull together a final proposal. They don't mention the COLA here specifically, but once again, referring to that second paragraph, they do mention that they strongly oppose any change to the benefit structures that state retirees currently receive. And so I think that you mentioned that they strongly oppose any change to the benefit structures that state retirees currently receive. And so I think that, I assume that would apply to a COLA change from their perspective as well.
Thank you.